another wonderful engagement, by the way. Some of these data will sound familiar, but the goal here really is to provide a quick snapshot of who these students are and some key demographic background and defining characteristics as well. Next slide. So to get us started in this regard, we know that California, nearly 2.5 million Californians are Black Californians, right, which represents about 6% of our state population. And more than a quarter of Black families in the state are living below the poverty line, meaning that they're earning substantially less than $25,000 per year. And nearly 1/3 of Black Californians have attended post-secondary education, so they've attended college to some degree, but have not earned a degree. Next slide. We also have to recognize that our work prioritizes the community college because the community college is the primary pathway to post-secondary education for people and communities who are disproportionately impacted. And so we see this play out very clearly for Black Californians. 72% of Black students who are enrolled in a public post-secondary institution in California are enrolled in one of the state's 115 community colleges. Comparatively, about 9% are enrolled at a CSU, and about 3% are enrolled in a UC institution. And one of the reasons why community colleges are so critical and so important to the post-secondary aspirations of Black Californians is that nearly 2/3 of Black high school graduates are not eligible to be admitted to the UC or the CSU because they have not successfully completed the A through G requirements. So for many of these students, the community college is the only real affordable pathway to the baccalaureate degree. Also want to note here that Black community college students are not reflective of the typical or the traditional college student population. So oftentimes when many people think about who college students are, they think about your traditional student who matriculates right after high school, who's living on campus, who's investing all of their time and all of their resources towards college. Well, that's just not the reality for Black students in California's community colleges. The overwhelming majority attend part-time, right? So more than 3/4 are enrolled part-time. Part-time meaning they're enrolled in less than 12 units per term. And the reason for that is that because they're taking care of other responsibilities. They're working, they have family commitments, they have other issues and other pressures that's requiring their time and attention and resources, meaning that they don't have the opportunity to attend full-time, among other things. And we also know that more than half of these students are adult learners, meaning they're age 25 and older. Next slide. We also have to be mindful of this. While the community college has been an essential pathway to post-secondary education for Black Californians, far too many who attend leave before they ever achieve their goals. For example, only about 3% of Black students actually transfer within 2 years, right? So I know many of our institutions are designed to be 2-year institutions, at least historically they've been designed to be 2-year institutions, but only 3% of Black students who attend actually transfer within a 2-year time frame. We also have to be mindful that only slightly more than 1/3 actually earn a degree, certificate, or transfer within a 6-year time frame. And then, we also have to be mindful that despite decades of initiatives and partnerships and efforts to improve articulation, far too few Black students transfer to one of the state's public universities. Only about 45% of Black students who transfer from a California community college transfer to a CSU. And the numbers for UC are even more discouraging. Only about 11% transfer to a UC institution, which I think all of us would agree is just not acceptable. Next slide. Luke and I have had the opportunity to engage in quite a bit of research over the last nearly a decade that has been focused on underrepresented and underserved students in community colleges. And what we find is that Black students in community colleges experience a multitude of challenges that impact their belonging, well-being, and success. So we know that Black students are overrepresented among students who experience basic needs insecurities, such as food and housing, transportation challenges, and I would say in the context of COVID-19, access to Wi-Fi and technology. Pressures that are situated in what we call the environmental domain are also salient for Black students. The environmental domain includes all of the factors that exist outside of the context of the institution, but have an influence on student success, such as work, family commitments, financial pressures, and stressful life events, to name a few. In our qualitative work, we have found that Black students routinely experience racial microaggressions and perceive the campus climate as racially hostile towards Blacks. Deficit perspectives are also salient amongst educators who teach and serve Black students. Many believe that Black students are not as intelligent, motivated, or committed to their academic pursuits, which has an effect on the time and the energy that they invest towards helping and getting to know Black students. Black students are rarely exposed to, we also know that Blacks are underrepresented among the faculty ranks, especially when we're talking about tenured faculty, and community colleges are not well represented. Blacks are not well represented among the ranks of administration in community colleges as well. So we're thinking about your directors, your deans, your vice presidents, presidents and chancellors. There's not an equitable representation there of Blacks in those roles. Black students are also rarely exposed to a curriculum that is culturally relevant and affirming, where they see positive images and representations of themselves, where they get the opportunity to apply the things that they're learning to their lived experiences, and where they learn about Blacks who've made important intellectual contributions to the fields that they're studying. And finally, the last point I'd like to make before we transition to Luke, on many campuses, support for Black students is limited to a very small and designated program or space, such as Umoja or EOP. And although these programs and the colleges who oversee them do amazing work for Black students, they should not be expected to be the only units on campus that's engaged in intentional efforts to support Black students. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Luke, who's going to share some findings from some research that we've had the opportunity to do over the past several years.
All right, everyone. Well, I'm glad to also be joining you here today. And what Frank and I are going to do is share some data that we've collected as part of the data that we've been engaged in working with colleges on. So we have a couple surveys. The first one is a community college success measure, which is a student survey. And the other one is the Community College Instructional Development Inventory. The student survey data that you're going to see is based upon a California sample from our larger data pool, while the CCIDI data is more so a national picture of what we see, but we think it's still informative for today's conversation. Next slide. So we know that there was already a conversation as part of this week talking about issues such as food insecurity and housing insecurity, but we also wanted to add our own data to this conversation, mostly because we collect our data on insecurities different than most organizations and shops and institutional researchers, in that the way that we collect our data is through randomly selected course sections with in-classroom samples. Said differently, most of the research that you probably have seen on food insecurity, housing insecurity, et cetera, has been through an online survey. And for anybody here who's taken a class in methods, you would know that an online survey is going to yield a certain type of bias. And if we're talking about students who experience food insecurities and housing insecurities, they may also struggle with access to reliable technology, and that can have an impact on those assessments. And so first slide here really is just about housing insecurity. We know that that's a large concern across the board, that about a third of our students, regardless of race or gender identity, do experience this. But when we look here at these data, what you'll see is that the yellow bars represent our African-American men and Black and African-American Black women. And you notice that they're among the groups that are the highest represented among those who experience some type of housing insecurity. Now, that's not necessarily just homelessness. It could include a student who is couch surfing, sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet. in some sort of untenable living situation. So it's kind of a larger picture of what this looks like. But this tells us that many of our students are struggling with this challenge, particularly our students of color. On the next slide, you'll see what this looks like for food insecurity. And one of the things that you'll see is that our men of color, in particular Black men in this sample, are among the highest represented for those who experience food insecurity. And then you can see for women that Black women are the highest group, second to only multi-ethnic women. Now, here's something important to keep in mind as you look at this data. Our food insecurity data is focused specifically on those who experience acute food insecurity, where they don't know where their next meal is going to come from. They don't know what they're going to eat next. And so this is not just like marginal levels that you might see in other research. This is looking at the most acute form. And you can see that this is prevalent among our students of color, and it's certainly relevant to the experience of our Black students in community colleges. On the next slide, we transition to looking at another type of insecurity on the next slide, and that is transportation concerns. So when we think about transportation concerns and we think about insecurities just in general, oftentimes it's restricted to food insecurity and housing insecurity. But our work really focuses on what we call the big four: food, housing, transportation, and employment. Because it's not really that any of those things exist in isolation. In fact, most of our work shows that a student who has one of those insecurities usually has 2, 3, or 4 other types of insecurities. And so it's really about having a holistic picture of how a student is experiencing college. But one of the things that we've learned with transportation is that for some of our students, they don't have reliable vehicles. So they might be taking multiple buses or multiple trains, or wherever they are, having to take multiple modes of transportation to be able to get to campus. Or they might be walking long distances to get to and from campus, or they might be relying upon an unreliable vehicle or to get a ride from a friend, right? So not having their own form of transportation, and we know that that can have an effect on success. Even more so, the research that we've done on food insecurity shows that those who experience food insecurity usually spend more time traveling to and from campus. So the students who have the greatest level of challenge also spend the most time getting to and from campus. And when you see the data here for Black students, you can see that for Black men, for example, 42% report transportation concerns in comparison to 26% of white students. So obviously a very different experience. Now on the next slide, we're going to talk about how this relates to employment, because employment is another type of insecurity that's not talked about a lot. But we know that in our community that Black students are often unemployed because of systemic racism and oppression, or more likely underemployed, meaning that they don't have jobs that essentially pay them enough. And then what we've found is that in our qualitative research is that Black men, and we would certainly assume that this applies to many other underrepresented students, are typically concentrated in the jobs with 3 general characteristics. First, they're in jobs that are physically demanding. So they're moving boxes, digging ditches, stocking shelves, doing construction site cleanup. They're in jobs that second occur late at night. So they work the late night shift or the overnight shift, getting off work at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning for their first class at 8 a.m. And then third, that they're in jobs that are transitory in nature. So in a job for a period of time, out of that job, and another job for a period of time, out of that job. So constant transitions. And all the data that you see here that we're presenting, this is some of our the newest slice of data that we have. So it really gives a picture for what our students are experiencing just in general. And of course, all of the different types of insecurities are further amplified in a COVID environment. On the next slide, what we'd like to do is talk about beyond these external pressures, how internal pressures can also take place. So we don't collect data anymore that looks specifically at stereotypes, because we found what we would expect to find most of the time, which is that our Black students report that they experience stereotypes more often than any other student group. So we switched a couple years ago to a measure that looks at preference. To what degree do I believe that my faculty member has a preference for someone from a different racial, ethnic, and gender group? And so this is the level of disagreement. So the higher the bar, the more negative. And so you can look on the left-hand side, this is whether a faculty member appreciates me, whether a faculty member on the middle are interested in me and my ideas. And on the right-hand side, whether or not they give me attention in comparison to these other students. And with disagreement, you can see that higher levels of disagreement across Black students in comparison to white students, in some cases, nearly approaching 1.8 to almost 2 times as likely in some cases. So we can see that not only do these students have these external pressures, but they can have internal pressures on campus where they might feel that they're less appreciated, that faculty members aren't as interested in them, or that those faculty members don't pay attention to them in comparison to their white peers. Next slide. In our work, we've also looked extensively at the concepts of masculinity. And this is really rooted in Frank's work, his background and focusing on college men and masculinities and how that influences student success. And what we've honed in on are 3 different types of hegemonic masculinity. So this is kind of negative types of ways that men socially construct their identities as men that can influence success in college. The first is, am I willing to seek out help? The second is, do I believe that that I'm not the sole person who needs to be a breadwinner, that can be something that is a shared responsibility? And do I perceive school to be a feminine domain as opposed to a domain that's equally suited for men and women? So in this case, the higher the bar, the more the perception that may be viewed as traditionally unhealthy using that conception. And what we can see is that across the board, men struggle with these challenges. They struggle with this notion of having to ask for help, right? Because they may perceive that as I will be viewed as weak or inferior in comparison to my peers, right? So what we want to do is recognize that across the board, men struggle with this. And while there's not incredible variation that I would point out here in relationship between Black men and their peers, I would just know that it's a pattern that we have to be attentive to, we have to be aware of, and it certainly is amplified again in a COVID-like environment where now I'm seeking out help through virtual modalities, or now as a breadwinner orientation, I'm thinking about how do I provide for myself, my family in an environment where only essential workers are working. And maybe I'm fortunate to have an essential role, but maybe the essential role that I have is one that constantly puts me in a position where I'm exposed to people who may be sick. So all these things certainly become much more complex in this environment. Next slide. So what we did for today is we looked at a slice of our data on predictors of being on track. So students who indicated that they were on track to achieve their goals. And we looked at variables that we collect that focus on what's called campus ethos, the climate and the culture of campus. And we identified, and these are in rank order, and this is based upon a backwards logistic regression. If anybody's interested in the details, I can just send me an email. But this is based upon a backwards logistic regression, essentially identifying what are the top 5 predictors for Black men, what are the top 5 predictors for Black women. You may notice here that there is no data that's being reported on transgender or gender nonconforming, and that's simply because our sample size is not enough. But those experiences are certainly worthy of additional attention and certainly warrant our support. So I would just say, if you look at this, you can see that for Black men, the number 1 predictor of being on track that was from that domain was whether or not counseling faculty communicate to them that they care about them personally, whether staff members say to them that, you belong at this institution, whether instructors are committed to learning about them and their lives, right? Learning personal information about them, whether instructors are committed to engaging them on academic matters inside the classroom and having those conversations in class. And outside of the classroom, when they see their instructor on campus, are they willing to say hello to them, other than what we see in a lot of our studies, which is a student sees their faculty member sees them, faculty member puts their head down or pretends to get on the phone or walks the other direction to avoid interacting and engaging with them. For Black women, we see that it's instructors who validate them on whether communicating messages that you can succeed in college, that you have the ability to do the work, conveying to them that they value them in their presence. And then, of course, communication of care by staff members, particularly those who are in the computer labs and in the library. So these are just some holistic campus ethos predictors that we should keep in mind as we move forward in terms of how we can best support the success of Black students. Now, on the next slide, I'd like to shift to a different conversation, which Frank brought up already, which is that we have a high number of students of color who attend our community colleges, yet the representation of faculty of color is very low, and even more in particular for Black faculty. And in fact, in our national sample, 73%, 74% really, of faculty members who responded were white faculty in comparison to 6.2% that were Black faculty. And in our national sample that I'm going to show you, this is a survey of faculty members asking them, do you do certain practices in the classroom that we know are important for success of our minoritized students? So the first practice is relationship building. Are you intentionally going about learning students' names, referring to them by their name, and gaining an understanding of their goals, their academic goals, career goals, and personal goals? And one of the things that you can see is that in comparison to their peers, our Black faculty members, in comparison in particular to our white faculty members, and of course not all of our white faculty members, we have many great white faculty members who do wonderful work, but if we look on the whole, they're far more committed to building relationships with students, particularly students who might come from minoritized communities. On the next slide, we can see that they are also more committed to engaging in culturally relevant teaching that addresses bias and stereotypes, that recognizes the intellectual contributions of diverse peoples, that engages diverse lives, issues, and experiences in the curriculum. And you can see that when we look across groups, that there's variation, but certainly our Black faculty are among those who are most committed to engaging these practices to support the success of our underserved students. On the next slide, you can see that there's also a focus on being intrusive. In our data on whether or not faculty members are committed to being intrusive about both building relationships and providing support to underrepresented and underserved students, we can see that, again, there's differences across groups, and our Black faculty are among those who are most likely to be doing this. This is important because, again, when we're talking about some of our students, there can be an apprehension to seek out help. So it's important to have faculty members who will facilitate connections with colleagues and support services, who will proactively provide support to them and guidance, who will require them to use supplemental instruction and do those things that are important. The idea is to reach out and provide a net of support that's so tight that students don't fall through it. And then on the last example that we have for you on the next slide is on racial microaggressions. We know that in this current time, that bias is greater now than it has been ever before in our learning context. And we did a webinar yesterday, myself and my colleague Frank, talking about how we can respond to racial microaggressions in this environment, realizing that because we have incomplete information, because our time is constrained, because we're experiencing stress and insufficient sleep, because we're in heightened emotional states, that those are the conditions that produce implicit bias. And so we are seeing more both overt and covert forms of bias that are taking place. And when we look at the faculty members who have an understanding of that bias, we see that, again, it's our diverse faculty members, particularly our Black faculty, who have that understanding and that shared lived experience, which we believe best prepares them to engage students who come from those diverse communities. Next slide.
Thank you, Luke. So I know quite a few of you on the webinar probably wonder, like, okay, this is great information, it's important to know, but what should I be doing about it? And to respond to that question, we'd like to offer 10 equity-minded recommendations, things that campuses should be doing, things that educators should be doing in order to ensure the success of Black students. Next slide. So first, we need to make sure that students have what we call a welcoming matriculation experience. The experience needs to be both seamless and welcome. From the moment they set foot on campus, we've got to be intentional in letting them know that they belong at the institution and that the institution is invested in their development and their success. A key aspect of this is making sure that the colleagues they encounter at spaces like the Welcome Center, financial aid, counseling, registration, any of those core services that they'll be accessing early in their matriculation, that they need to have an experience there that with colleagues who are both validating and affirming. And of course, this is important for all students, but given some of the data points that Luke just shared, we can see why it's critical for Black students. particularly those who are entering a community college as adult learners. And to be honest, that's entering with a great deal of apprehension and are asking and wondering, is this a place for me? Should I be here? Should I be, or should I be invested in doing other things? Next slide. So during this matriculation process, we need to have strategies for identifying students who may be in need of targeted intervention and support. So like we know, for example, students who work more than 20 hours a week, we know former foster youth, for example, students who are experiencing basic needs insecurities, and students who've been away from education for say more than 5 years are likely to experience challenges, more challenges than those who may not be experiencing these challenges. Once we know who these students are, we have to make sure that we have colleagues who are able to work with them and to do so in a case management approach. And the case management approach is important because students need to have be able to address these issues in one stop, so to speak. They need to have one person who's reaching out to them on a periodic basis. This can't be something that occurs once or twice a semester. It has to happen on a more frequent basis, depending on students' needs. And some wonder, how do we do this? How are we going to do this with so few staff and with so many students? And one thing that we often suggest is that you target the students who you know are at most at risk, right? So if you know that you have students who are already involved in your MOJA and already involved in EOP, they're probably pretty well set up, at least initially, with having support. So I would prioritize students who are not connected to a community at all, just floating out there by themselves, and making sure that these students are the focus of this early intervention and outreach. Next slide. So we all know that our institutions have policies and bureaucratic processes that make it difficult for students to access resources and support that they need to be successful. So one of the best examples of this is that most core student services on campuses are only offered between, say, 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And this is an institutional barrier for students who are attending part-time and taking classes in the evening hours. So resources like financial aid, counseling, and personal wellness must be accessible, on a more readily basis, and should be able to be accessed without jumping through a bunch of hoops in order to access them. Next slide. This relates to another one of the key data points that Luke shared around basic needs insecurities. We know that Black students are overrepresented among these students who report experiencing insecurities. Therefore, our efforts to support, any effort that we engage in to support Black students must take this into consideration and must make sure that basic needs support is readily available to them. One of the most important things that we can do is to encourage faculty to put language in their syllabi about how to access basic needs support and to point this out to students on the first day of classes. We also, again, 2 recommendations ago talked about the case management approach. If you have someone who's taking a case management approach to supporting students, then making sure that students have support around basic needs can be among the things that this person, is responsible for making sure that students are well supported in this regard. And we see some campuses doing amazing work around basic needs in light of COVID-19. And I would say that we have to make sure that we keep the same energy when normal operations resume. Next slide. We have to focus on developing healthy identities. Make sure that all of our efforts to support Black students help them to develop healthy racial and gender identities. We highlight these 2 identities because they tend to be the most salient amongst Black students, but understand that students have other salient identities as well. This is really important for Black men who often struggle with gender-related concepts, conflicts that impact help seeking, perceptions of breadwinner orientation, and perceptions of school as a feminine domain. Next slide. We know that all campuses have equity plans, but not all equity plans are created equal. We get to see a lot of plans that focus on closing gaps, but very few that transparently talk about actually eliminating gaps. The equity goals that we set forth should focus on eliminating gaps, not just closing them. And we need to really make sure we're doing this with the focus on the metrics that are articulated in the Chancellor's Vision for Success and the student-centered funding formula. Next slide. In our hiring processes, we need to be more intentional in hiring faculty and staff who have a proven record of success with culturally diverse students. As a part of this, we need to be intentional about hiring more Black faculty and staff as well. One of the ways that we can go about doing this is to ask candidates to offer concrete examples of this, both in the application process as well as a part of interview processes. So we need to stop using the hypothetical and asking the, what would you do if questions. Instead, we need to ask candidates to talk about what they've actually done in this regard. Next slide. Professional development is one of the most important strategies that we have to build institutional capacity to support Black student success. So we need to make sure that we have professional development that is offered to everyone on campus, that's offered on a regular basis. And we really need to have professional development that focuses on 4 key areas. An understanding of equity-mindedness and race consciousness, understanding of racial microaggressions and how to respond to them when they occur, conveying validation and authentic care to students, and being able to utilize culturally relevant and culturally affirming curriculum. Next slide. So we need to identify statewide policies and initiatives that can be leveraged to facilitate Black student success. So things like guided pathways, Triple SP, the Student Equity and Achievement Program all provide important opportunities in this regard. One of the most important things that we can do is to infuse equity for Black student success into these initiatives. Next slide. And our last recommendation before we transition to the Q&A period, we need to routinely collect data from Black students because doing so allows us to gain deeper insights into their needs, their experiences, and factors that influence their success. We know colleges do a really good job of collecting quantitative data. Some even go a step further in making sure that those data are disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and gender within race and ethnicity. But it's also, and while that's important to do, it's also equally important to have conversations with students where they can actually talk about their experiences and where those experiences can be learned and understood in their actual voices. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Bull, and looking forward to engaging further during the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris and Dr. Wood, again, for nourishing our souls with the necessary data and making the case for our students, but not just stopping there. You're providing tangible solutions for us to implement in our spaces. So how do we do that? So to help us operationalize these profound concepts and guide us from theory to action, from a CEO's perspective, we have the Chancellor of the San Jose Evergreen Community College District and an Amen board member, Dr. Byron Breeland. Dr. Breeland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Buell. First, I want to thank Dr. Harris and Dr. Wood. You both have been prominent scholars on the front line of equity for a number of years now, and I know that everybody appreciates that overview that you just presented outlining the keys to Black student success. I also want to thank you, Dr. Buell, for the work that you're doing this week throughout the African American Student Success Week for that introduction. Again, my name is Byron Breeland, and I serve as the Chancellor for the San Jose Evergreen Community College District. And I've also been a MIN board member for the past 13 years. And throughout my career in higher education, which has spanned 4-year as well as 2-year higher education institutions over the last 25 years, I've had a chance to see a lot and do a lot and be a part of a number of different programs, in particular for students from African descent who were in fact not performing well. And I want to share with you really just in a couple of minutes that I have here before we do get to the Q&A, some of the things, again, encapsulating what both Dr. Harris and Dr. Wood have already spoke about, but really sort of to put it into context from a practitioner's perspective. So I want to start out by saying that we all must embrace the fact that the achievement of opportunity and equity is certainly a problem of epic proportion, not only for African-American students and their families and communities. It affects the well-being of the entire nation. In fact, researchers have found that the persistence of the educational achievement gap imposes on the United States the economic equivalent of a permanent national recession. And now with the COVID-19 crisis, many African-American communities have actually entered a depression with the loss of jobs, lack of access to resources, increased food and housing insecurity, and other cruel negative economic outcomes. The truth is, school access, performance, and achievement constrain the future economic opportunities of many African Americans. When accounting for social class, the gap in educational achievement between African Americans and other groups is substantial. Although we are focusing on African American student success, of course, members of other communities of color are far too often victims of racism and poverty. So we want to acknowledge that they also share many of the same challenges. I think that most would agree that today, education is not only needed to strengthen the US economy, but also for the future of American democracy. As educators, we must truly believe in our hearts and accept that the life and subsequent learning conditions of Black and African American students, again, as was eloquently outlined by Doctors Harris and Wood, are not due to natural law, meaning predetermined by nature or as an objective fact that is universally applicable. In other words, this is not simply an "it is what it is" situation. To that end, we must understand that past and present economic and social conditions are at the root of the achievement gap. Societal efforts to overcome ill effects of prejudice and discrimination for African Americans have not been effective enough. There continue to be inequities in almost every aspect of life, including the field of education. At the same time, the educational requirements for successful and fulfilling careers has been raised due to advances in science and technology, which places an even greater burden on underserved communities and schools. Of course, the absolute solution to the education and opportunity gap is the elimination of racism, class prejudice, and oppression altogether, but we know that is not likely to happen in the near future. In the meantime, creating an ultra supportive environment on college campuses seems to be the most immediately achievable practice, and perhaps the only chance for students from challenging backgrounds to be successful in school and in life. My final thoughts for leaders and educators working in the higher education space follow. First is to recognize cultural differences that set high academic expectations for all students, but also, and perhaps more important, establish high expectations for student success on the institution itself, so that there is greater accountability for Black student success across the institution, especially when it comes to meeting students' transfer, degree, and job training goals or needs. Next, we must place an intentional focus on teaching and learning so that curriculum is not only intellectually stimulating, but it is also culturally affirming. All students need to see their history and contributions to science, the arts, and literature, as well as having accepting and welcoming spaces on campuses, especially our African American, Latinx, and API students. Then we must all agree that a good education is far more than good test scores. Education is physical and mental health, the arts and music, citizenship responsibilities, and mentoring relationships. These are all equally important and should be planned for and supported in an educational environment if we are serious about all of our students crossing the finish line. Finally, we must commit to an ongoing professional development activity for all staff that place race and poverty issues at the front and center of our discussions, so that we recognize that Black students, families, and their communities are among those who are most disadvantaged by the effects of systemic and institutional racism, such as mass incarceration, exposure to poverty, unemployment, and the resulting food and housing insecurities that accompany the aforementioned burdens that I mentioned. As an example, Black people and other minority groups are overrepresented among those who are infected and dying from the current pandemic, as they are most likely considered essential workers and have longstanding health disparities, especially a lack of health care. Our nation cannot continue to accept the status quo when so many people are being left behind in a system that does not serve them as well as their peers. We must have the courage to make decisions to place equity at the forefront of our policy and resource allocation decisions on our college campuses and in our classrooms. I am thankful for the discussion this week, as well as the opportunity moving forward to take on this ongoing crisis of inequality with more of a sense of urgency and purpose throughout the system, and engage in meaningful discussion to tackle the real issues head on, racism and poverty. I firmly believe that we can do this together for the benefit of all. I look forward to joining you and performing the necessary work ahead. And I want to thank you for your kind attention. Please take good care.
Thank you, Dr. Breeland, for providing us that executive leadership and purview and perspective, and really giving us the macro and micro, and giving us also the socioeconomic conditions that exist in your comprehensive analysis of the executive. We want to actually mention the fact that these webinars are interactive. We're not talking to you, or actually we're talking rather with you. So to provide us with that, we want to kind of bring in my colleague, Professor Eric Haney, to share with us a couple of comments and or concerns or tweets that you shared on Twitter. Professor Handy.
Thank you, Dr. Bull, and thank you to all that's tuned in. Using the hashtags Black Student Success Week and the hashtags Black Student Success, both on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we have a couple of questions. The first question I point out is from @perfect_smiles2, the student. What do you plan to do to help students who are unemployed succeed and get the resources that they need? And then another question from @HARMONIEYACOB. What can a Black student do to help progress us as a race?
So Dr. Harris, want to take that on first?
Yeah, I'll take the first question. What do we plan to do to help Black students who are experiencing unemployment? So, some of the things that we advocate is that if students are able to get campus jobs, and we know that campus jobs don't always pay enough money that, what students need to actually take care of families as well as themselves. But, if they can find employment that is on campus or employment that's close to campus that's related to their career goals, then it allows students to earn money while also being able to attend school. And it increases the likelihood that they'll persist to graduation. So this is something that we often advocate for campuses. We know that, sometimes the resources for doing so are limited, but it's something that we think is really important. It's not that working in and of itself is bad. Actually, I think Luke did a study not too long ago that said some work is okay, but where it becomes challenging is when the work exceeds more than 20 hours a week. When you're dealing with some of those conditions like the ones you shared, you're in jobs that are physically demanding, that are occurring late at night and that are occurring overnight, that are completely disconnected from your academic and career goals. That's where the challenges of work come to bear. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that, being able to take a part-time job or being able to take a campus job is not something that's available and accessible to everyone. And so then I think it's important for faculty and staff and educators that are working with students understand that this is a real concern for students and that they need to design an experience that accounts for this added responsibility that students have, that they're not just able to be a full-time student and invest everything that they have to their academic pursuits.
Thank you.
And I already forgot the second question. I think it was, what can Black students do? What was it, Professor Handy? If you could repeat it, I'd be happy to answer it.
What can Black students do to help progress the race? Yeah,
so I think what Black students have always done that have been successful and that have been important is there are two important things. They have created communities for Black students on campuses, particularly campuses that haven't always been willing to do that for Black students, right? So campus clubs and organizations, and and even building virtual communities, I think are really important. And using those as opportunities to recruit new students, to recruit Black students to the institution, and to reach out to students who have recently applied to the institution, who are going to be attending, and kind of showing them the things that they need to know and do in order to access resources and be successful. That's one thing. I think the second thing, though, is that students usually have more voice than they recognize, right? A lot of times students actually have more voice and more influence than someone who's working at the institution. So making sure that students are communicating their needs, making sure that students are holding the institution accountable for what they need and deserve in order to be successful, I think are also, part of it. And I also recognize though that comes with a lot of, time and physical and emotional labor. So making sure that you're taking care of yourselves while doing this, and that you're doing it in coalition and in collaboration with others is important as well.
So self-care is very, very critical. Thank you for making that point, Dr. Harris.
Yep.
Next question is for Dr. Wood. Any suggestions on how to, this has actually been a very, very important question that's been reoccurring throughout our week. It comes from an educator. Any suggestions on how to fend off accusations of racism against white students and process racial battle fatigue when we do this work? Many students are not used to inclusive classrooms and target faculty of color when they have to be in such environments.
Yeah. So those are really two questions. So let me take the second one first. And racial battle fatigue is a concept that's been developed by William Smith that recognizes that as we engage in work that's race-based as advocates, that there is a certain personal toll that comes with that by merely being a person of color in these spaces that were never designed for us, and for the most part don't want us as faculty, staff, or positions of leadership, or as students. And so there can be negative psychological effects that come with that, and negative physiological effects that come with that as well. So I encourage you to see anything that's been done by William Smith on that. In terms of the first question, which is how can we advocate in an environment knowing that there are those who may have supremacist ideologies, whether they're students or colleagues who might want to push back. I think that that's part of the long history and struggle of those within our community. I would say that I would first of all just acknowledge that it's not easy, but also acknowledge that if we don't do it, if we aren't the person who's going to continue to push those conversations, then we are allowing harm to manifest against our students. We know that when our students experience microaggressions, when they experience bias, when they experience overt discrimination, that there's harm that's being done. And we have to recognize that as educators, we have far more privilege than they do. And so for us to be cautious about engaging is not recognizing that and using our privilege to help advance that conversation. And again, I want to recognize that's hard, that's difficult, but it's also part of the struggle. I would also put it in context historically and say, if it wasn't for Black folks who worked on the Underground Railroad, many of us would have still been in slavery, right? So with doing work that is about addressing injustice always comes with peril.
Thank you for that, Dr. Harris. This question is for Dr. Breeland, and then feel free to tap in as well, Dr. Harris, Dr. Wood, if you want to. The question is, how can we engage stakeholders to be deliberate about spotlighting the plight and challenges of our Black students when colleagues in management keep stating that all students messaging is the focus?
So how do you get, if I understand the question correctly as you read it, and you may not have interacted with the person who asked it, but as I hear it, how do you get all stakeholders involved when they don't seem to be as motivated?
Yeah, and then also moving it, when you're trying to do something that's specific for Black students, moving it from the all students matter to the specific issue addressing Black students or students.
Okay. Yeah, and this is a common challenge that folks have, especially trying to move the needle, if you would, on many campuses. And one of the things that have come up really in the last, I would say, decade is folks have been a lot more intentional about looking at data, gathering data, bringing it to the forefront, having people actually have discussions about who is actually being impacted, and really how you direct resource at that. So I would say, first and foremost, you have to be able to get the data, put it on the table, and have real conversations about it. The data does not lie in terms of what's happening to our students. And I think creating an institutional culture that examines data on a regular basis, also has folks come in, typically, and I hate to say it, always from the outside. No one has ever profited in their own land. Have people come in, give information about what's happening nationally, a broader context of what's happening socially, economically, to come in to professional development days, connecting with that data. and then having the institution be accountable, especially from a policy direction. And here's where things are now changing on the equity front, is really having boards or any other governing bodies or leadership, really putting into strategic plans, a clear path to closing equity gaps and addressing equity gaps amongst all students, especially the ones where those gaps exist. And again, it depends on where you are in terms of what those challenges may be and who's attending your institution. But primarily where you have African-American students attending, it's consistent across the country in terms of their ability to achieve, be successful, and move on to completion. So I say examine data, make it a part of institutional practice, and weave it into strategic plans and policy as per the governing board, and to push that agenda. And that's where people can start to develop some of that institutional or cultural change or shift.
Thank you. Thank you for that. As we continue to talk about Black student success and student success, we have questions that ask, there's been a lot of recommendations that seem to be multi-deficiency based. And is it possible for recommendations to be asset based? The question is, how do we improve academic success for Black students, and how is it defined?
I could take a shot at answering that question. Before I do, though, I'm mindful of the time, so I want to make sure we give a shout out to Dr. Breeland, who did a great job of being a respondent in this session, and Dr. Bull, who did an amazing job of moderating, and of course, Professor Handy. I like to think that the recommendations that we offer are more so about what the institution should be doing, and doesn't put further burden on students and directing students to do more things. Part of the way that we approach our work is from an equity-minded and institutional responsibility perspective, and inherent in that is the assumption that students have what they need to be successful. So we're not advocating to change or fix students. What we advocate is to change and fix institutions. So the 10 recommendations that we offered were developed with that concept in mind. At the same time, though, we also understand that anyone can apply a recommendation or strategy, and if it's not applied from an equity-minded perspective, then you're just doing deficit work. You're doing equity work from a deficit perspective. So that's what I would have to offer in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harris, Dr. Wood, Dr. Breeland, my colleague, Professor Handy, as well as the team that's behind the scenes from the campaign, as well as the league. You've equipped us with the necessary tools to truly advocate and fight for our students as we leverage the system to propel our Black students to the middle and working class, and ultimately financial freedom. This is what is needed. I hope you all view this work as liberation work, breaking the shackles of debt and poverty that have led to systemic inequities to uplift our collective community. This is why we call it the community college system. We put the community in community college. Remember, knowledge without action is like a tree that bears no fruit. So please continue the conversation as you see on the hashtag here on the slide. We're gonna have a Twitter chat tomorrow. We implore you, we encourage you. We highly recognize the fact that we need to have these conversations to be ongoing. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today. Remember, we're not talking to you or at you, but with you. And so we want you to dial in tomorrow for our COVID-19 discussion. But on Friday, we have a special student panel. And I want all the students out there to really, truly engage that student panel and continue to tweet. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.